Last time, I told you how hackers broke Sony consoles. Now it's Microsoft's turn to get worked over. If I ask you what you associate with the Xbox 360, most of you will probably say this: it was easy to hack and play games cheap. The people's console. That's exactly what it was. Despite Microsoft's efforts to protect their devices, hackers never sleep. But how did it all begin? What led to the first Xbox hacking methods? What technologies did hackers use to bypass protection and run uncertified programs? How did Microsoft react to hacked consoles appearing? That's what I'm going to tell you about today. The original Xbox could obviously run only licensed programs. The console checked digital product signatures every time it was turned on, and when you tried to run pirated content, the console would lock up and show an error message. So, right after the console's release, hackers started figuring out a method that would make the Xbox ignore license checking. In my video about the original Xbox, I already told you that Microsoft console was rushed out because of competition with Sony. So, it used components practically identical to a PC. So first thing, hackers pulled out the standard 3.5-inch IDE hard drive from the console, connected it to a computer, and started studying it. To hack it, hackers needed to extract the so-called system kernel, but they discovered it wasn't on the hard drive. That trick didn't work. So their next step was to target a chip called EEPROM. Hacker engineer Andrew Huang, known as Bunny, discovered 512 bits of unencrypted information on this chip. In it was found strange code that was in turn just part of a bigger code, and to discover the source, he had to come up with a way to read information from the data bus between the processor and the south bridge of the motherboard. For this, he constructed and connected a special programmer to the board that allowed him to put the console into debug mode and read the code necessary for hacking. However, on top of everything else, he still had to figure out how to decrypt the obtained data. Huang developed a technique for bypassing protection that became known as the cold boot. He would turn off the console at the moment encrypted data was being transmitted, and then turn it back on when the data had already been transmitted. The OS didn't have time to encrypt the code before transmission, which allowed him to read it. That's exactly how the system kernel necessary for hacking was found. Overjoyed, Andrew published his findings and a copy of the kernel on his blog. However, Microsoft clearly wasn't thrilled about these events. This would guarantee the console getting hacked. Lawyers started pressuring Huang, demanding he delete all the information he'd obtained and threatening him with lawsuits. The hacker stated on his blog that he hadn't broken any laws, since he didn't provide information on how to use this data to hack the console, and wasn't distributing it for commercial purposes. But just to be safe, he did delete all his work from the site. But he 100% knew what he was doing. Everything that gets on the internet stays there forever. His research and discoveries instantly spread across the web and later helped hackers develop the first ModChips, which, by the way, didn't take long to appear. They showed up in 2002, less than a year after the console's release. With their help, you could run Homebrew discs and games from other regions on the console, which was previously impossible. One of the first chip developer teams was Team Executor, which included Antic, the Executor, and Gary Opa. They released a mod chip called the Executor 1. Andy's pranks got out of control, so to speak. When installed in the Xbox original, the chip connected to the processor, intercepted by the console's boot process, and modified it so the console wouldn't check disk authenticity before running it. Besides that, it also had the ability to switch operating modes. In normal mode, the chip enabled running burned disk. In another mode called Live Mode, it changed processor parameters so the console could connect to Xbox Live without risk of getting banned. And the best part was that the modes switched automatically, which allowed gamers to play online without any hassle. Amazing! However, soon the mod chip lost its relevance. Programmers figured out that if you desoldered the boot chip from the motherboard, the Xbox would try to boot from the debug port. This was a side effect of console production. The OS was loaded into consoles at the factory through this very port. Hackers simply connected to the debug port using a programmer, and then used it to load custom firmware onto the console. Microsoft hastily released a new console revision with new encryption keys. The Linux project team studied the new protection methods and soon developed a new way to install custom firmware on new Xbox revisions through simple grounding of a pin on the processor. The processor in the original Xbox contains a signal trace that interacts with the system protection chip. This chip would block the console's operation if it didn't receive the right signal from the processor. The Linux project team discovered that if you ground this signal pin, the protection chip simply stops working. To ground the pin on the processor, hackers used a special adapter board, and after some serious tinkering, the programming team got the ability to install custom OS. This method became known as the softmod and became the most popular way to hack the original Xbox. In 2004, Microsoft sued the Linux project and of course won the case. So the programming team was forced to stop further work on developing console hacks and pay a fine. You pay the fine, and Nintendo's like, so you get a foul and owe us $100 million. From now until the end of your life, you'll pay us 30% of your salary. The lawsuit not only stopped further work by Linux project, but also served as an example for other teams involved in developing hacks and console modifications. Moreover, that same year, Microsoft started sending firmware updates with new patches over the network. Fortunately, in those days, the internet wasn't as widespread, and this still didn't stop the enthusiast community. In subsequent years, new hacking methods appeared. Now, hackers targeted hacking the OS itself. In 2004, a hacker team known on the Floodit Math forum published instructions on how to use a new hacking method. Programmers created and uploaded to Xbox special fonts and game saves that contain malicious code, overflowing the console's memory buffer and allowing them to install custom firmware. Modifying fonts and saves became possible because, unlike other content, they didn't require digital product signatures, and were therefore vulnerable to modifications. And the absence of a hypervisor, which we'll talk about in more detail later, gave fonts and saves complete control over the console's resources. This hack became a real milestone in the Xbox community because besides running pirated games, it opened up possibilities for running all kinds of homebrew, including emulators for various gaming consoles, multimedia players, browsers, and of course, Linux, which turned the original Xbox into a powerful multimedia hub. And I'd like to talk about media players in a bit more detail, because their absence on the Xbox was a huge oversight by Microsoft. Many people who weren't into video games bought the PlayStation 2 just because it was a decent and cheap solution for watching movies on DVD. Naturally, tons of people wanted to see similar functionality on their brand new Xbox, but for some reason, it wasn't there. And the Xbox technically could play DVDs, but you needed to buy a special remote with a receiver. Without it, the functionality was blocked, which really didn't make users happy. However, after installing the hack, they got the ability to install the XBMC Media Center, which allowed users to not only watch videos, but also listen to music and browse photos after uploading them to the hard drive or a flash drive. But here's the main kicker. You know Kodi? One of the most convenient and popular solutions for playing video files on Windows, Mac OS, smartphones, and so on? Well, that's the grandchild of that very same Xbox Media Center, from the same developers, but of course way more advanced. By the way, Andrew Huang eventually wrote a book about the details of hacking the first Xbox. Hacking the Xbox, an introduction to reverse engineering. And like a true hacker following the philosophy of free access to information, a few years later he just openly posted it online. Very interesting reading about how the console's internal architecture works, how he hacked it, and particularly about the crazy American copyright laws he encountered. The reading is definitely niche, not for everyone, but it appears at the top of all lists of books about hackers and for hackers, so it's worth knowing about. But we're moving on to Microsoft's next console, the Xbox 360. After suffering such a serious fiasco with the original Xbox, Microsoft seriously improved the protection of their new console. Besides several new software encryption methods, the console got a hypervisor. It handled license checking and wouldn't allow running pirated content or injecting third-party code. Because of this, the hacking method using saves, fonts, and everything else immediately fell off, since they were also checked by the hypervisor. Since the system itself was way too well protected, hackers first focused on the DVD drive. The thing is, even though it wasn't without protection either, it was much weaker, and the drive had serious privileges. It was the one that reported to the console about the legitimacy of the disk inside it. And its firmware was just sitting in the external memory of this drive. All hackers had to do was extract it, modify it, and flash the changed version back to the drive after first putting it in debug mode. This is what a programmer under the nickname Commodore Forever did in 2006, releasing the first drive modification in May of that year. To put the drive in debug mode, they used special devices that enthusiasts assembled and sold online. An example of one of them is the Xbox 360 CK3 Pro. The firmware allowed reading encrypted sectors on the disc and fooled the console into thinking a legitimate game was installed on the burned disc. Additionally, the flash drive would be recognized by a computer, which allowed using it to copy games from licensed discs. The main thing was that you needed to extract and write down the key from the original firmware code that the console used to communicate with the drive. It was unique for each console. If you lost it, God forbid, then you were screwed. From then on, your Xbox drive couldn't read any discs at all, not even legitimate ones. The very first Xbox revisions came with drives jointly manufactured by Toshiba and Samsung, but new times called for new solutions. So, later on, pretty much everyone except the lazy was making drives for the console. Already in 2006, for example, some users risked finding a Hitachi creation in their red-eyed friend. This guy, by the way, could already check firmware integrity on board and naturally knew how to have fun with new encryption methods. This was handled in two ways, using a Slacks Linux boot disk that, when in the console's drive, would run a program allowing you to copy the firmware, or by shorting the drive's power connectors with paper clips or pins, for example. After such tinkering, the drive would be recognized by Windows, through which they would load the hack onto it. Microsoft started releasing new revisions, coming up with new encryption methods, developing new drive models, and banning pirates on Xbox Live. But all this was in vain. Hackers kept finding new ways to bypass the protection over and over again. Samsung and BenQ drives were cracked using special SATA controllers, like this guy here, the VIA 6421. All this was plugged into a computer's PCI slot and apparently reminded the drive so much of its native motherboard that it would open up completely. Hitachi models were a bit trickier though. They used special audio discs for those. The first nominee for the title of Pirate's Headache was the drive that appeared in 2008, manufactured by Philips and Lite-On, better known as just Lite-On. Its chip processor was covered in resin, and it couldn't be fooled even with adapters. There were some workarounds that initially gave certain effects, but experts recommended buying soldering irons. So many boards were destroyed in those bright times. Even the multiplayer problem was solved with a device called the Devil Mod 360, which automatically switched the console between legitimate and pirated firmware. Methods for copying discs also appeared, whose images passed all security checks. In 2010, Don Matrick dropped the Xbox 360 Slim version on store shelves with size changes and noise reduction. A new variation of the Lite-On also made its way into gamers' homes. In addition to previous innovations, its controller was replaced, and bypassing the new restrictions required time, albeit small, but still time. While cool hackers tried to get the chip firmwares in the craziest ways, desperate folks simply removed old flashable drives and put them in new Xboxes. Hackers extracted the chip, delitted it, and through trial and error figured out that if you disconnect one specific contact, the ability to flash firmware would return. And so was born one of the most extreme console hacking methods called the kamikaze hack. To pull it off, you needed to drill a hole in the chip to disconnect the troublesome contact. Needless to say, a millimeter left or right would guaranteed brick your console. Pioneers had to play it by ear using only guides from the internet, but a bit later the process became much easier as special templates and even devices for safe drilling appeared. From the outside, it might seem that the battle for disk drives with such sketchy tricks didn't bode well for Microsoft. However, unlike the samurai, Sony's green guys didn't care about the path. They only cared about the goal. Less than a year passed before the new drive version appeared on the scene. The new Lite-On, or Lite-On, good luck flashing that, as they called it at Microsoft. Hackers weren't so categorical though. After playing around with the new hardware using old school methods and getting no results, they quickly figured out that it was easier to just completely replace the board, and so began appearing the boards for flashing Light Touch Ultimate drives, familiar to many for their inhumane price tags. These were essentially homebrew copies of new drive motherboards with flashable processor models. Some in the community considered such complications unnecessary, and therefore simply soldered processors from original drives. The donor market had never been in such bloom. The flow was so great that the population of wild processors very quickly dwindled to nothing. But soon, this ailment was also overcome, first by modernizing the board with a chip that made firmware work with later controllers. And then the Chinese altogether managed to move everything to the rails of a more common analog. All these movements with controllers and soldering cause insane delight, but let's be honest, normal people didn't want to mess with all this. And bricking a brand new piece of plastic really had an adventurous spirit to it. So local tech wizards and other Uncle Joe types from the local repair shop who knew how to handle a soldering iron and some choice words got themselves a good income. People went to them like pilgrims, left their console, and an hour or two later picked it up along with a ticket to the world of cheap video games. Healthy lifestyle options with instant purchases at the electronics market were also available. No money was too much there. It was a completely different story when it came to discs. Buying ready-made options when you could do everything yourself, your wallet wouldn't let you. Fortunately, DVD burners were already available. And it's right here that a second front opens up for Microsoft. Those who pirated in those years know about LT 2.0, 2.1, 3.0 firsthand. All these firmwares were responses to measures Microsoft took to protect their part of the console. Disk types changed, new games required forced system updates, firmwares would crash and rise from the ashes. At some point, the battle moved to Xbox Live, and waves of bans put an end to pirates' freedom. Each day, the curtain fell harder, but offline with certain caution, everything continued to work and delighted pirates with new titles. Drive firmware flashing is great and all, but many also wanted to run various Homebrew content on their console. Homebrew. In other words, emulators, players, and for this, they needed to hack the operating system. And so began the battle with the console's cursed hypervisor, which, I remind you, blocked running unsigned code. There was no progress on this for a long period of time until, in Update 4532, Microsoft made an oversight that made it possible to execute third-party code on the console. Licensed game disks helped with the hack. At some point, it was discovered that audio, graphics, and shaders on game disks weren't encrypted. Hackers patched one of these files, inserted the modified disk into the console, and installed Linux on it. Unfortunately, by the time of publication in February 2007, the method had already lost relevance since a newer OS version was in circulation where the hypervisor bug was fixed. Hackers couldn't accept such a loss, so they started thinking about how to roll back the console's OS. The first, well, so to speak, working hack method was developed that same year. A bit of background, on the Xbox 360 board there are two ports that developers used for debugging the processor and graphics chip. You can't just connect to them, the protection won't let you through. However, if you slightly modify the chip responsible for powering the device, this problem goes away. After such manipulations, hackers managed to use these ports to roll back the OS to the vulnerable version. It would seem like victory was at hand, but not so fast. Few dared to use this hacking method because as soon as you use such a hack, the console's video adapter would start working unstably. Games would crash with errors, and the console could simply turn off and never turn back on. Plus, in 2008, a new revision came out that got rid of the vulnerability. As you can see, the topic of running homebrew code was very tightly compressed in terms of time frames, and it's even more surprising that in this narrow window of released device versions and systems, the seeds of future operational culture managed to flourish. Knowledgeable people started hunting for systems on which they could deploy the so-called JTAG hack. Shells like Freestyle were written for hacked devices. This opened up a world of true piracy comfort for people. You could skip burning disks and just run games from flash drives, or transfer them over the network from your computer. But existing in such a limited time frame, this movement was definitely doomed. At some point, due to manipulations with game images, it simply hit a dead end. The mainstream gamer switched to flash drives, and homebrew culture went into the shadows to gather strength for a new evolution. Following 3 years, all hacker teams, enthusiasts, and developers, led by the anonymous Glee, tried to develop a universal working method for hacked Xbox. The result of the community's collective efforts was the so-called Reset Glitch hack that came out in 2011, 6 years after the console's release. The hacking process begins with installing a mod chip on the console's motherboard. This chip performed several functions and forced the processor to work at minimum frequency. Because of this, it would start glitching and a breach would open for running unsigned code. Actually, this process is much more complex. It went through several phases, but there's some specialized math in High Elvish there, so we'll stick with the simplified description. The point is that to the applause of pirates, Xbox's protection finally fell. All further hacks were based exactly on the reset glitch hack and differed only in nuances. Problems arose in 2011 when the hacker-hated Xbox 360 revision with the Corona board came out. The board's architecture differed from the usual one, which ruled out the possibility of learning the CPU key necessary for the hack. Previous methods of extracting it simply didn't work, and without this key there was no way to install Reset Glitch. It ran unlicensed software on the console, with the help of which they managed to discover and extract the CPU key. The technology was called Double Glitch Hack. From this moment on, Corona revisions could be flashed, but the next revision, called Winchester, was already free of such vulnerability. Xbox 360 consoles with this board under the hood still can't be hacked to this day. No matter how hard programmers try to execute the Reset Glitch hack, the processor simply ignores it. You could say that in their final step, Microsoft beat the pirates. Meanwhile, Microsoft was actively suing hackers. In 2011, the American company began legal proceedings against Team Executor, who created and distributed tools for hacking Xbox 360. As a result of this case, the company was obligated to pay compensation of more than $950,000. Also in 2011, a US court issued a verdict against two groups involved in hacking Xbox 360 and selling modified consoles, sentencing them to prison. One of the defendants was found guilty of copyright violation and sentenced to 18 months in prison, while another was sentenced to 30 months for the same reason. These are just some of the most high-profile cases. There were many more. Honestly, I think this is some kind of trash, like putting people in prison for this kind of stuff, for letting guys play Halo 3 for free. It's insanity. In this sense, Nintendo actually did the smartest thing. The guy will just pay them money for the rest of his life, and that's punishment enough. After all, nobody got hurt. On the other hand, if we're talking about the Nintendo situation, the guy had already managed to visit prison for a couple of years before that, so... Xbox One came out in 2013, and for 12 years now, no one has been able to crack this console's protection, while competitors' consoles get hacked in no time. After Xbox 360 became the people's console thanks to hacking, Microsoft definitely learned all the necessary lessons and closed all possible security loopholes in the console, and even got a bit into social engineering. Xbox One's protection technology is based on using a hardware security module called the Security Processor. This module is physically separate from the main system and provides an additional layer of protection. It handles user authentication, checking OS and application integrity, memory access control, and protecting encryption keys. One of the key elements of Xbox One's protection technology is using a new encryption method. Each gaming console has a unique set of keys that are automatically generated and used to protect data. This protection also prevents buffer overflow. The protection system in Xbox One turned out so complex and successful that in 2020 they developed a special integrated processor chip based on it, called Microsoft Pluton. It's supposed to eventually replace TPM. That's the protection used in PCs and laptops starting from 2003, by the way. Besides good protection, the fact that the console doesn't enjoy the biggest market popularity also played a role. But the main reason is, of course, that Microsoft has now, for 2 generations in a row, allowed running Homebrew applications on their devices without any hacks, no jumping through hoops. And the almost complete absence of exclusives for Xbox One doesn't create the need to develop a console emulator. However, Microsoft removed all emulators from Xbox Store at Nintendo's request, which really pissed off the community. And the reaction didn't take long. Developer hackers are now actively looking for ways to bring emulators back to the console. One of the most prominent devs, Gamer13, wrote on his Twitter, "Retail emulators are not dead," posting a screenshot, "Never take hackers' toys away from them." That's the story of Xbox console hacking. Despite the fact that Microsoft doesn't have as many consoles in their lineup as Sony, there was still plenty of interesting stuff to tell you about today. The work of hackers is something else. It's just mesmerizing. That's all from me. Thanks so much for watching the video. Like, subscribe, good luck.